Greetings, boils and ghouls, goblins and ghosts. You're tuning into Too Ghoul for School, the podcast, a death-style podcast for the morbidly inclined. Class is in session. I'm your ghoulish hostess, Jocelyn Wen, aka Glamour Ghoul Beauty School. I'm an actress, I have my BA in psychology, and I'm a purveyor of all things dark and spooky. One of my earliest exposures to goth and gothic culture was an SNL skit, so a parody of goth called Goth Talk with Molly Shannon and Chris Kattan. I was, 6 or 7 maybe, and it was one of my favorite things. I mean, probably because Chris Kattan's ridiculous in it. The voice he uses is not very goth, but I love that. And I just thought, it was so wonderfully creepy and weird and fun. And then, for some people, I'm sure it's the goth kids from South Park, which is a pretty funny and, not totally wrong depiction. I mean, it's obviously a caricature, but it's amazing. Yeah, a lot of people have a very distinct image in their head of what goth is or what it is to be goth. But how do we define it? What exactly is goth? This is actually a pretty multifaceted topic, and when I started putting this episode together, I knew I needed to narrow my scope. So what I'll be discussing today is primarily goth as a genre of music and a subculture. It is also a genre of literature, a style of architecture, and yes, it also refers to the ancient Germanic tribes that were largely responsible for the fall of the Roman Empire, if you want to be pedantic about it. I'm here for it. Ultimately, it's one of the most well-known, long-standing, enduring countercultures coming out of the 20th century, and it is still going strong. So let's jump into it. For this week's lesson, we're going to do our first Spooky 101 segment of Season 2, What is Goth? When it comes down to it, goths are anybody that listens to goth music. Yeah. That's simple. You don't have to dress or act a certain way. Just simply put, if you listen to, goth music, dark wave, gothic rock, you're a goth. That's basically it. Now, what is goth music? So, goth as a genre of music comes out of the post-punk movement of the early 70s and 80s. Although post-punks derived much of their sound and aesthetic from the punks of the 1960s and 70s, they sought to find something more romantic, otherworldly, and refined. Post-punk paved the way for more experimental sounds and musical textures. We're stepping away from the harsh rawness of punk and introducing a more atmospheric yet hollow melody, echoing tribal drums and synthesizers, a sort of mass melancholy with dark lyrical themes. Many of these post-punks, inspired by the otherworldly theatrics and androgyny of glam rock, transitioned into a group known by many as the New Romantics. In fact, David Bowie was a huge inspiration on the aesthetics of the goth movement. So the New Romantics got their name because they would find inspiration in Romantic and Victorian era literature, art, philosophy for song themes and motifs. They longed for something with more depth and substance than the anti-establishment ideology of the punk movement for anarchy's sake, something brooding and poetic. So something dark and decadent would soon arise and gave way to the gothic genre of music. Additionally, many goth bands took inspiration from old horror films of the 1930s like Dracula and Frankenstein, both of which are books from the Romantic era. Also, silent film actors and actresses like Clara Bow and Theda Bara. Patricia Morrison, a goth rock bassist from Sisters of Mercy and many other bands, actually cited 1950s horror movie hostess Vampira as the prototype for gothic aesthetic and sentiment. We're going to cover more on Vampira in a later episode. Now, it's difficult to pinpoint when post-punk ended and goth began, but it's thought by many that the true catalyst of the Gothic rock movement was the release of Bauhaus's Bela Lugosi's Dead. Some of the forerunners of the Gothic movement include bands like Bauhaus, of course, Sisters of Mercy, Joy Division, Susie and the Banshees, The Cure, Christian Death, and The Damned, to name a few. Also Alien Sex Fiend. A second wave of influence that went into goth was during the 80s and 90s. We had Gothic metal, so bands like Typo Negative, Paradise Lost, The Gathering. If you want to learn more about the Gothic subculture, I highly recommend Orphea's YouTube channel. I'll link it below in the description. She goes into all the different subcategories of goth, including trad goth, we got cyber goth, mall goth. I don't know if that's actually a thing. I think that's more of a derogatory term for people who wear Hot Topic goth, but we've all done it. Corporate goth, baby bat. I really like, for myself, with my kind of glamour ghoul thing, I do more of like the psychobilly vintage goth. There's a lot. There's more than that. So really go check her out, Orphea, on YouTube. There's some dispute over what genre these bands fall into when you're comparing, like Him or HIM, His Infernal Majesty, and The Gathering, if they're goth or gothic metal. And for a lot of people, like myself and Orphea included, she was more in the Belgian metal scene. That's how we discovered goth, was through metal, or at least I was originally really into metal and punk, and then I kind of like found my way through those into kind of dark wave and dark pop into goth. So how do we reconcile these different like branches of goth? And I really love what Orphea says about what kind of brings all these different branches of goth together. And it really is that everyone has a fascination and love for the dark and macabre. And it's really seeing beauty in darkness, to quite literally quote her, because she said it so perfectly. Go watch her video, basically. So I'm going to round back a little bit and touch on the Romantic era, since, as we discussed, so much of the goth movement is informed by it. Because the thing is, Gothic sensibilities and way of life existed well before the 70s. It just wasn't known as goth. The term Gothic does date as far back as the 4th century, referring to the nomadic Germanic people that fought against Roman rule, as we mentioned earlier. So there was an association made, and in the Middle Ages, the term Gothic actually became synonymous with brutal and barbarous. The term would be later used to describe the architecture style prevalent in the medieval period by those who were in favor of classical architecture. They called the style Gothic as a slight. They found it to be offensive and in opposition to the classical Greek architecture that they were fond of. It would be used again in the late 1840s to describe the Victorian Gothic or Gothic Revival architectural movement. And this would then be applied to the literary genre Gothic horror, as they were often set in Gothic architecture buildings, as this would create a sense of foreboding and haunting from one's past. Finally, rounding this back out to the late 70s and 80s, when the New Romantics would dust off the term, honoring the literature they were referencing for their music. So in a completely oversimplified sense, that's how goth went from referencing a group of ancient Germanic people to everything we think about when we hear the word goth. So as we wrap up, I want to leave you with some resources in case you want to dive deeper and learn more about Gothic subculture. Again, highly suggest Orphea's channel on YouTube. Really love her stuff. There's also Maddie Danger and Dusty Gannon, or Goth Dad, from Vision Video. Scarecrow Joe on TikTok is also an excellent source for learning about goth and goth tangential music. So I'm going to link their info in the bio below. Their Instagram handles, TikToks, whatever their major source of information sharing is. And you can check them out. I also wanted to share a couple of really great books on the subject. So Some Wear Leather, Some Wear Lace. Really, really cool book. Dusty Gannon, Goth Dad and Orphea also recommend this book. And there is also a new one that I just got this week, but I did start reading it. It's called The Art of Darkness, The History of Goth by John Robb. It came out this year, 2023, so I haven't had a chance to include the plethora of amazing information that he's included about the movement and everything, and the aesthetic, the music. He dives all into the history of goth, much deeper than what I covered today, and it's super, super good, really hard to put down. I love the way he writes, the way he describes everything is just super fun. The language he uses, it's definitely one of the most comprehensive sources on everything goth. And if for me, I initially started like saying I was spooky, but then it was like I started listening to the music, and so it was kind of hard not to just be goth. I'd love to hear, if just see yourself as a spooky person and you don't really listen to the music, or for you being spooky and listening to goth and everything is all one and the same, however it manifests for you, your relationship to gothness and or spookiness. So please share your spooky journey in the comments below. I would love to hear it. I hope you've enjoyed this week's episode of Too Cool for School, the podcast. Don't forget to like, share, comment, subscribe. Thanks for sitting for a spell. Stay spooky, boils and ghouls, goblins and ghosts. Till next time. What is goth? Baby, don't hurt me. Much deeper than what I covered today. God damn it. The goth kids from South Park. My husband and I often do the dance that they do, which is essentially like the Charlie Brown dance. When I'm listening to my spooky tunes, I'll just come over and be like, it's so dumb, but we love it. Atmospheric and hollow, enduring countercultures coming out of the 20th century. Damn it. And this would then be applied to the literary genre Gothic horror, which I have to sneeze. I can't get one away. It was coming out of the 20th. Why do I keep wanting to start trying?